On this episode of Scots Abroad, we talk to someone about life off the pitch. From his time with the BBC, covering Italia 90, then moving to the US to be part of the press office team for USA 94. He was then the voice of the Revolution for MLS team New England Revolution, where he also covered South American football, the Champions League, before coming back home to cover the Scottish Premier League. He's then been immortalised in 2019 as he took the role as co-commentator alongside Lee Dixon of FIFA 19, a role he has continued into FIFA 20. He also has a special place for Germany in his heart, the language, the society, the people, the football. And now he has a new role, Ambassador of Football for Berwick Rangers. This is Scots Abroad with me, John Walker, and this episode's guest, Derek Rae. Thank you so much for joining us, Derek Rae. How are you keeping?
Nice to be with you, John. I'm fine. All good here. It's a beautiful, bright morning in New England and nothing to complain about.
How are you finding life without football? Is it as difficult as we all are?
Well, for me, it's a bit of a transition because my working life is football. But, I think sometimes in a crisis, we find other things to keep ourselves motivated and occupied. And I spend a lot of time, I have to say, following the news. I know that's not for everyone, but I'm a bit of a news junkie. So I actually find it quite calming to be on top of what is happening around the world. But as I said, I know that's not the way everybody would want to take in what's happening with regard to this crisis.
You do tend to commentate on a variety of leagues, whether you're freelancing or working for a network. Is this the longest break you've had out of commentating on any football then?
I'm not sure it is because, remember, we have the closed season every year. And if it's not a tournament year, then it's often the case that I'll have 6, 7, 8 weeks off. And I must say, during the closed season, I always try to give myself that time off and not necessarily be looking at teams and stats and squads and stories and things like that. So, in a sense, if we treat this as the closed season, and it is the closed season, then I think maybe we're better off.
So, you grew up in Aberdeen?
I did.
Like most people, I like to find out what was your earliest memories of football, whether it was playing or going to?
Earliest memory of going to football was in the 1970s, the very early 1970s. And my father and I, on a Saturday afternoon, would often go down and play putting. There was a putting green or a series of putting greens down by the beach, right next to the Links golf course. And if you know the geography, that's just a few hundred yards from Pittodrie.
Yep.
So one Saturday we were putting and we heard the roar of the crowd from Pittodrie. And you can tell that my father's an Aberdonian like me because with 60 minutes played in the game, he said, come on, let's see if we can get inside. You can usually get inside for nothing around the hour mark, which was the tradition back in the old days. They would leave the gates open and people could leave, people could come in. So we did that. And it was an Aberdeen-Dundee United game. And I was just transfixed by it all. Because you have to remember, John, that back then, we watched football on TV on black and white monitors. We didn't have colour TV. So to see a football game live, and I just remember all this colour, in front of me and thinking, wow, I'd love to go back and try this again sometime. So we went to the next home game and pretty much every home game after that for a good number of years. In terms of playing, I played with enthusiasm like most youngsters in Aberdeen at that time, certainly with more enthusiasm than skill, but through the school years and in the playground. But I think I realised early on that my future was more going to be talking about football rather than playing it.
So that brings me to my next point. Why did you stop playing football as such and not look into other aspects outside the commentary to try and keep yourself within the game? So if I'm thinking the likes of coaching?
Really, because commentary came to me as a thing I was passionate about very young. And when I say that, when I was 7 in 1974, we bought our very first cassette recorder in our house in Aberdeen. What's a cassette recorder? Young people watching this will be asking. A cassette recorder was a revolutionary device back then. And then I got my own portable version of it. And I would just talk to myself. And I realized from a young age that this was something that I enjoyed. And I think even at that young age, probably had a bit of an aptitude for. So I took this on, and the coaching side of it didn't interest me to the same extent. I think it was fairly clear that I wanted to be a broadcaster. My heroes, in addition to the footballers, were the broadcasters of that era. So you can tell my mind was going in a slightly different direction. And, as I say, I played football with enthusiasm, but I realized that inner working side of football probably wasn't going to be for me. And I put all my energies into, vocal training, my own vocal training. Nobody taught me anything. It was all just my own trial and error stuff on tapes. And I was also somebody who was interested in languages. So that went hand in hand with that. So there's a sort of a pattern there that for me, it was about the voice. It was about using it and hopefully in an effective way.
Yeah, I read that you used to do commentary on the 1974 World Cup where Cruyff was so pivotal. And then you went to Aberdeen reserve games to do the commentary for your own kind of background and your own CV work. At what point during that did you realise that becoming a broadcaster or commentator could actually be a potential career choice?
To be honest with you, I always saw it as a dream that, maybe I'd be lucky enough to realise, but the likelihood is it would just remain a dream. That was maybe the way I was brought up, that, you don't get too much ahead of yourself, and you just, you do yourself justice. But something like commentating on football, I mean, there wasn't even really a job in those days to commentate on football. There were 3 or 4 people in the entire UK who did that job. So it wasn't realistic to think you were going to get into that field. But it was, I think, as I got into my teens and I began to communicate with my radio hero, David Francie, who was the voice of Scottish football back then. And anybody of my age or older will remember fondly David Francie. He was, to me, the voice of Scottish football. And throughout our communications, he really encouraged me, made me believe in myself that maybe it was something that I could take down the line. But I genuinely thought that the likelihood was my career path would be in languages, either as a teacher, a translator, something of that nature. And maybe the commentary stuff would be on the side.
Yeah, you kept communication with David Francie all through your time. What was it you were studying at university?
I studied German, politics, and international relations. And I suppose you could say that I've used all 3 indirectly in connection with my commentary work. When I studied German, it was for a purpose. Well, first of all, I loved the language and still do, and it's a very important part of me. The politics and international relations, both hobbies to this day. But undeniably, politics and international relations come into football too. So I think I was quite well served.
Yeah, we will talk about the German link in your language and the Bundesliga later on in the interview. So you get approached 1986 by the BBC, and it's to cover a Kilmarnock versus Dumbarton match. I think that was in the second tier at the time. How did that come about?
Well, I was at university one Friday afternoon, and I got a call from Charles Runcie, the head of sport at BBC Radio Scotland. Now, I should say that a few weeks earlier, I had received a letter from Charles Runcie, which I'd originally sent to my mentor, David Francie. But unbeknownst to me, he had passed it on to his boss, and he had got in touch with me and said, if you're in Glasgow at all, or if you're planning to come to Glasgow, let me know, because I'd love to sit down and talk to you about your commentary. So we sat down and we had a great chat, and he said, I like what I hear. I'd love to give you an opportunity sometime. I just can't tell you when that would be. So I left that meeting thinking, okay, great. Well, shortly after that, there was an Aberdeen Celtic game, which wasn't the live commentary match, but he needed a reporter to fill in doing that game on the radio. So I did that, and it went well. And then sort of thought, okay, let's see if I get an opportunity to do a commentary sometime. Well, the opportunity came with that Kilmarnock-Dumbarton game, and it was because David Francie had picked up a knee injury. So here I was on the train, Aberdeen to Glasgow, 19 years of age, and stayed overnight in Glasgow and went down to Kilmarnock with John Gregg the next day to broadcast the game. The legendary John Gregg, certainly a legend to me as a young football fan, former Scotland Rangers captain, former Rangers manager, and we did the game together, and that was my debut.
It's quite funny to hear you say that. I've heard that story on another podcast, that you kind of got your break through someone getting an injury, which is obviously how young people normally get breaks in football. It was a very quick turnaround from that to then being asked to do the England-Scotland match at Wembley midweek.
It was, and it was most unexpected, I can tell you. So I did the game. Clearly, the bosses had it in mind that if it went well, that was going to be my second assignment if I wanted to take it on. But they didn't tell me until I got back home to Aberdeen that night, and there was a message called Charles Runcie. So I called him, and he said, yeah, well done today. Okay, he said, are you ready for this? Your second game is going to be England against Scotland at Wembley this midweek, because David hadn't recovered from the knee injury, and Radio Scotland had already put the plans in place to cover that game with Mike Ingham, John Gregg, and I would be the third commentator. So that was my second game. And you have to remember at that time, I had never been to a Scotland-England match because Aberdeen to Glasgow in those days, it wasn't a journey you did every week. I'd never been to Wembley. So at the age of 19, I was handed my second game as a professional on the air. Scotland didn't win, sadly. It was 2-1 to England, but I'll always have fond memories of that night.
So what happens thereafter? Because you're still at university. I've read some of the quotes from David Francis, spoke very highly at the time. Did it feel like, off the back of the knee injury, because I know he was only reporting for another year after that, did it feel like he knew he was going to retire and potentially he was someone you've seen as coming in to fill a void that was going to be left?
Well, I remember later, David was actually my guest on a Radio Scotland show, and we spoke a bit about this. And he wrote a book, in fact, just at the end of his time as a commentator. And what a career he had! As I say, to me, he will always be the voice of Scottish football. But I think he had it in his mind that at some point he wanted to retire from commentating. He was very devoted to his wife Sheila. He loved commentating. I don't think he enjoyed the travel as much. He didn't enjoy, bouncing around, and the European travel, I think, was becoming a bit much. And I think he was looking for the right time. But he probably was also waiting for somebody to pass the torch to. And it seems that I might have been that person. So, it was a wonderful year I had working for Radio Scotland as a reporter, commentator, presenter, sort of did it all. And also doing some TV work for them, which is something I hadn't necessarily planned for. And that meant that I actually travelled with David on a few games. He would do the radio, I would do the TV. I remember being with him in Switzerland for a Sion against Aberdeen game in 1986, which was actually to be Alex Ferguson's last European game in charge of Aberdeen. But I think he just felt he had done it. And he wanted to spend more time at home, and maybe this young commentator who he had been encouraging, and make no mistake, he was a huge influence on me, was coming through, and maybe it was a good time to hand over the reins. Yeah,
so the Sion Aberdeen game, that was your first televised game. Aberdeen lost 3-0. Can you tell us a bit about, at that time, 1986, you're 19 years old, how do you research for football matches? To people my age or even younger, it's baffling to realise you didn't have the knowledge of just being able to click on somebody's Wikipedia or any football stats website and be able to get everyone's last 10 years of their career. How do you go about? Where do you start?
Well, in 1986, it was a very different game. And from the research point of view, we just didn't have resources that you take for granted nowadays. So we would go into games and, it was a case of trying to find lineups from a team's previous match, talking to as many people as possible. That's the one big difference, I think, from then until now. Now you can do a lot of research on your own, just at the click of a button. Back then, you didn't have that luxury. I didn't have a computer in 1986. So that Sion team that I covered, that would have been the first European game that I covered as a commentator professionally. That Sion team luckily had a couple of players who had performed in the 1986 World Cup. They had a player called Boudabala from Morocco, who was very exciting and actually terrorised the Aberdeen defence that night. So I'd watched him during the World Cup and obviously knew a bit about him. But most of the other information I gleaned, and this is where the languages background can come in handy, came from talking to the Swiss commentators in the lead up to that game. And I made it a point to talk to my counterpart with the other network from the other country ahead of every European game in those days, because that was where you got the information that you simply could not get online because there was no online.
Yeah, and it was just really a huge curiosity myself. Our normal podcast is a betting podcast, and we have mounds upon mounds of data and websites and apps that we can use to find out everyone's stats for the last few games. And we even sometimes find it tricky to find the information that we require. So, that was, 30 years ago. Between 1986 and the summer of 1990, you were doing loads of live games for BBC Scotland, doing highlight package for Sports Scene, which had just started. How long before Italia 90 and Scotland's qualification did you realise that you were going to be part of the team that was going to cover the tournament?
I think I knew probably about 6 months before that World Cup. It had been hinted at certainly. I mean, they were making decisions up until probably Christmas time before, 6 months, as I said, before that World Cup. But it was always sort of touch and go, because what you have to remember is my role back then was as a commentator for BBC Radio Network. So in those days, BBC Radio Scotland would team up with their counterparts from BBC Radio in England and come up with one commentary team for the whole of the UK. And that can, be quite political in terms of the makeup of that. And clearly Radio Scotland wanted me to be part of it as their voice. But, the question was, would that be acceptable to London? Would they have somebody else in mind? There were other candidates too for that. So what they decided to do was have me be there as sort of the Scottish voice. The other commentator with the team was Ron Jones, great commentator from Wales, who had worked for BBC Network for a long time. And then the third member of the team was fellow Aberdonian and one of the greatest players ever to wear the Scotland shirts, Dennis Law. So that was our trio covering all the games. But from memory, it was probably about 6 months before the World Cup in 1990.
When did you arrive in Italy, and what was the criteria for what you were going to be doing before the build-up to the Scotland-Costa Rica game?
Well, as I say, my role was not just to be a commentator, but was also to be a reporter on call, really for all BBC radio outlets, so that, if Radio Scotland needed a specific piece on something, and it might not have been a football story, it could have been a news story, I was there to cover it. If there was, say, a player from Liverpool on the Scotland squad and somebody from, BBC's channel in Liverpool wanted something, again, I would facilitate that. So it was a lot of sort of bouncing around, obviously going to the press conferences every day, and I knew Andy Roxburgh well, so sitting in on the press conferences. In those days, the press conferences were a bit different. You had one for the daily newspapers, you had one for the Sunday newspapers, and you had one for the electronic media. I always found that very bizarre. I understood why it happened, and it was because the newspaper guys in those days carried a lot of clout, and they wanted to have their own individual session with the manager where they would get their own individual story, and they would protect that story, make sure it didn't get out, and then it would hit the papers at the appropriate time. I got all of that as to why it happened. I just found it a bit strange. I was actually kicked out of a couple of press conferences by newspaper people, and was a bit disappointed, to be honest. The SFA didn't stand up and say, no, you can't kick people out because they happen to be TV or radio. But anyway, that's a long time ago. Thankfully, things changed shortly after that. But that was really what I did. In addition to obviously commentating, and commentating was the main aspect of what I did, it was around the clock reporting assignment.
Yeah, and in the build up to World Cup 2018, you were recapping a story of arriving at the World Cup in Italia 90 and being a little bit worried about how much Costa Rica had been downplayed. And there was a story about yourself and Dougie Wernham actually going to their camp in Genoa to try and get a look at some of the players, the managers and assistant. Whose decision was that to go do that? Was that yourself?
That was me. That was 100% me. But I thank Dougie Wernham, who was my producer, to this day, that he went along with it. Because in those days, you have to remember that there wasn't the same curiosity about the opposition, perhaps. And I had to be curious about the opposition because I was the commentator on the game. I always prided myself on having information. And, it was much easier for me if it, had been a French team, a German team. I speak those languages. I didn't speak Spanish. Costa Rica, you have to remember, honestly, nothing was known about Costa Rica. We didn't have access to videos. We didn't have access to the internet, as I said earlier on. It was all about what you could find out yourself. And the problem with Costa Rica was that they had really sealed themselves off. They didn't want to talk to anybody. They had a coach called Bora Milutinovic, who I actually came to know quite well here in the USA. I don't know if we'll come to it later on in the discussion, but he was to be the USA's coach in the 1994 World Cup. And I've spent many a very enjoyable coffee session with Bora Milutinovic. But at this time, I didn't know him. He didn't know me. And I turned up at the training session. And again, there was a little bit of paranoia. It was like, who are these people? What are they doing? They've got a tape recorder. Why are they here? But I managed to get some really good information about Costa Rica just from the hour that we spent at this training site, a good hour or so away from Genoa. We seemed to be driving into the middle of nowhere to go to this training session, and it was not chock full of people at all. It was just the players, Boris Milutinovic, and his coaching staff. And I do remember when we got back, I forget who said this, people saying, why did you waste a day going all the way out there? You know, and I was thinking to myself, this is never a waste. And that's what I always tell young commentators. Preparation is never a waste. And you do it your way, and nowadays you might do it a different way. But back then, for me, as a bit of a perfectionist in terms of wanting to get my commentary right, that was worth its weight in gold, that day that we spent with Costa Rica.
And perhaps if the Scotland national side had sent a coach out, we might not have suffered the shock defeat that we did in that opening group game.
Well, I think, to be fair to Andy Roxburgh, I think, and people have given him a lot of stick, and the players a lot of stick for what happened in that game. I think it kind of went according to how we thought it would. Scotland carried the game to Costa Rica, but Costa Rica's plan was just better, more efficient, and they pounced when they had to. They defended manfully, bravely, and Scotland didn't have much imagination in that opening game. And there's no doubt about it, it really set the table for what was to come. It put Scotland under too much pressure because that was a game they needed to win.
Yeah, if anyone's not seen it, you should go back and watch it. There's a 5-minute clip on YouTube, or there's the 1990 review of the World Cup on Amazon Prime. And I think one of the closest chances we had was a 40-yard strike for Roy Aitken, if that sums up how the game was going.
Yeah, it was a strange one. You sort of kept thinking, okay, eventually Scotland have got to do something better here, but it just didn't happen. And I remember Andy, after the game, Andy Roxburgh, calling it an unstructured game, which that was the term that people sort of reflected on. I think what he meant by that was there was really only one team trying to play in the traditional way. But I think we were taught a bit of a lesson in modern tactics, as would have been the case back then. And Costa Rica, very well coached by Bora, I have to say, and he took those tactics to other national teams too. He wanted to coach Scotland, by the way. There's something that very few people know. He used to talk to me in years beyond that about having me help him get the Scotland job, which I said, well, if I had the power, Bora, I would love to. He said, no. He said, mention it to you. You must know people at the SFA. Mention it to them. He says, I would love to coach Scotland. He said, I will take Scotland where nobody has before. And by the way, I believe him. Yeah,
I guess so. Scotland were knocked out the group stages in that World Cup. You said you were part of the BBC network, so there was a Welsh commentator and an English commentator. Dennis Law was there. When Scotland get knocked out, is that the end of your trip, or do you then get assigned to another group, another section?
Well, I thought it was going to be the end of my World Cup, but much to my surprise and delight, BBC Radio in London asked, would you stay on and do some more work for us? So what happened was I was then reassigned to Rome, and I spent a few days in Rome as the presenter of their evening programs. They did a roundup program every night, World Cup Tonight, which I presented. And then they said, what we're going to do is send you back to Turin, where I'd just been. Scotland had been knocked out in Turin by Brazil with a goal quite near the end, sadly. And they said, we're going to send you back there. You've just done Brazil. You'll do Brazil-Argentina. So I went back to do Brazil-Argentina. Part of the deal was because I was younger and seemed to be, it's quite funny to hear these words in my mind now, seemed to be a bit more technically adept than the older people on the staff. They said, what we'd like you to do is just take a taxi, go to the stadium earlier, and if you could plug in all the equipment, we have some equipment we need to plug in, which is not there, but we trust you to do it. So I did this because they didn't want Dennis or Mike Ingham doing it. So they asked me to do it. So I remember having to make this sort of pit stop in the stadium to do all that and test it, and then went outside the stadium and came back in again for the game. So at the end of that tournament, that was your first international tournament. You'd been with the BBC for 5 years at that point. Do you feel there was anything you learned being away on assignment for a major tournament that you hadn't already in the previous trips to do European games for Scottish sides? Oh, I learned so much during that trip. I learned, I think probably, and I didn't necessarily realize it at the time, but I learned that you really have to pace yourself when you're covering a tournament, that you cannot go full on every day, all the time. I still struggle with it to this day with tournaments. I find that I don't sleep enough during a major tournament. I find that it's the sort of situation where if there's a spare hour to do something, I'll take that spare hour and do it, rather than saying, you know what, I need to get to bed, sleep, get 7.5 hours sleep, and then tomorrow's another day. But back in that World Cup, I was so determined to do everything and to be on top of everything. And, my head was spinning, I think, by the end of that World Cup, and probably was averaging, 3.5 hours sleep per night, which is not healthy for anybody. But as I say, I still struggle with it, but I always try to go back to that first World Cup in my mind and tell myself, sleep, rest, pace yourself.
Yeah, and after that tournament, you decided to leave the BBC a year later and become the press officer team for USA 94. Was that due to any relationships you'd built up with a World Cup media team at the 90 World Cup, or was that just something out of the blue?
It was kind of twofold, really. I had, in my mind, felt for a while that I would love to live in the USA. And that kind of came from nowhere, because as a younger person, I wasn't particularly USA curious. But around 1987, 88, I started to think, I've never been to the USA. Really would like to see what it's all about. And okay, it's the same language, but it's a very different culture. I knew that. And obviously I was interested in politics and thinking, why is their political system so different? So I began to go there. I first went there in 88 and went on my own and just, loved it. Loved everything about Boston, which was the first city I visited. And from that point on, tried to get over there as often as I could. Now, in 1990, I had met some of the people who were to be involved in the staging of the World Cup in 1994. And, just kept in touch. So when I decided that I wanted to go to the USA, and I pretty much in my mind after that World Cup in 1990 decided that that was going to be my next move. I didn't know in what capacity. I began making plans. Now, when I first arrived in this country, I'm talking to you from Boston right now, the Boston area. When I arrived, I didn't know what I was going to do. I was freelancing. I was doing bits and pieces here and there. And it was only subsequently that I was introduced to the people who were looking after the World Cup here in the Boston venue. Boston was one of the venues for that World Cup. That my eyes kind of lit up and, put it all together and realized that this actually could be something that made a lot of sense in terms of a relationship. And a guy I have to give real credit to is a guy called Jerry Trecker. And it's a small world, and this tells you about the small world of football. Jerry Trecker, great journalist, dedicated football journalist, football lover, going back years, from Connecticut, had written a book about football, The Magic of Soccer. And I had found this book in an old secondhand bookshop in Boston on one of my trips. And I brought it back with me. I'd read it on the plane back to Glasgow. And I just, thought to myself, this is a really good book. And here's an American who understands it. So as I began to make features when I was on Radio Scotland about the USA, there was a lot of interest. How are the Americans going to do this World Cup that they're now in charge of? When I began to make features, I thought, okay, I'm going to call Jerry Trecker. So I managed to track him down, managed to find his telephone number and called him up out of the blue. I think he was stunned that somebody in Glasgow at the BBC had read his little book. And I would have him on now and again. He was sort of my American correspondent. Now, it turned out that 1991, when I go back to Boston, again, this is the small world I was talking about, Jerry Trecker's brother, Jim, is a highly respected football soccer administrator, had been back in the days of the NASL in the 70s. Jim was the head of media for the World Cup organising committee. So the people in Boston who I met sort of got talking to Jim, who spoke to Jerry, who said, yeah, that guy Rae is somebody you should really talk to. He speaks languages. He's a football broadcaster. He knows the sport. That's somebody who, he's in Boston. He could be your man in Boston sort of thing. So it kind of worked, within a number of different channels. But it turns out that those relationships led to a job for me. And I have to say, the time I spent as press officer for the World Cup Organising Committee in Boston goes down for me as one of the happiest spells in my life. I was away from commentating for that period, but I feel that what I lost as a commentator, I really gained as a football observer. Because think about it, I got to observe that entire World Cup process from the inside. I got a bird's eye view of it. I was exposed to people who a normal journalist wouldn't have access to. When I did that job, okay, the first priority was to organize the media operation. That meant planning for the media center, all the tables and chairs, telephone lines, all that sort of stuff, but also working with international media and local media. So understanding where the sport was in the USA, trying to get the message across as to what the World Cup was. But the great thing about working in a small office and a small team is you can take on other responsibilities too. So we would get faxes, again, before emails, faxes coming in from the Dutch FA or the Argentinian FA. Dick Advocat, the Dutch manager's coming in to have a look at potential training sites. Is anybody free to drive him around? I'll do that. Yeah. Can I do that? Yeah, great. So I sort of, along with a colleague, became the person who very often was charged with, even though it wasn't within my strict job description, if I had time, I would make time to drive these people around and get to know them a little bit. So even before that World Cup and the games themselves and the operation of the games, doing that was something special. But beforehand, I learned an awful lot, expanded my horizons. And as I say, on a professional level, what I did as press officer for the World Cup, in terms of my experiences of doing that, are up there with anything else I've done.
And there was an attempt to poach you, I believe, by ESPN or someone else before that World Cup to do commentary. Is there any part of you that not so much regrets, because you seemed like you really enjoyed the role you were doing, but wishes they'd commentated on one of the games or some of the games, whether it was the 3-2 Brazil win over Holland, the Romania-Argentina game? Was there any games that you wish you had been there to call?
Oh, so many. In fact, we had some of them in our Boston venue, that classic Nigeria-Italy game or the Italy-Spain quarterfinal. I mean, you could take your pick. Funnily enough, I kind of had divorced myself from commentating for that spell. So when the offer came, and there was an offer that came in just a couple of months before the World Cup, and it was from ESPN, just saying, yeah, would you be interested? We've got a schedule together here. We think if you're interested, you could do the games in Boston and Washington, D.C. Now, they didn't know that I was the press officer for the organising committee. So I had to turn it down because I was committed to doing it. And to be honest, I was all in doing that job at the time. And it was a bit like commentating at a tournament. It was a 24-hour-a-day job. I didn't sleep much during that whole period. And I think on balance, it was the right decision to stay with that. It was never really a question for me because I thought to myself, okay, maybe I'm taking a gamble here, but life is full of gambles. I took a gamble to leave university when I did at 19 to join the BBC full time. This was another gamble in overlooking my profession to keep a job that really was one that motivated me, even though I knew it was only for a short time and that I might have to go back to that broadcasting well again very soon after the World Cup. But I think I made the right decision.
And part of that World Cup in USA in '94 was that the Major League Soccer was going to start in 1996. And at that point, you were the voice of New England, so you were the voice of the revolution. How did that feel being back in the commentary seat? And how is that set up? Are you a commentator just for their games, or are you a commentator for the Major League?
Well, I should say that 1996, I was offered the job of being voice of the revolution, which if you think about it, is a wonderfully evocative title to have, isn't it? I mean, who wouldn't want to be the voice of the revolution? It came about because I did obviously have good contacts within the New England setup, and the Kraft family, who were the investors in Major League Soccer from this part of the world and were to operate the New England team. They knew me, and they knew me as an operations guy, not as a commentator so much, but they said, no, you can be our commentator. And that is how it tends to operate here in the USA. The individual sports teams have their own broadcasting networks. Obviously, if a game is on national TV, that's different, but the individual teams have their own networks and their own commentators. So you are working for the team. You're still commentating on the game. And I always, took the mandate as one of commentating on the game first. I wasn't a fan of the team who happened to be commentating. I was a commentator who was broadcasting to fans of that team, but I always tried to be impartial during that time as the voice of the revolution.
How was the first scene covering that league? I believe I was looking at some of the attendances. Some of the games in LA, there were 60,000, 70,000. Despite not having it, I say this with the knowledge of that there is stories going back to like 1870, 1880 of soccer arriving in the US, but despite not having a huge background that we know of, what was the league like and how receptive were the fans of the Major League?
I just remember the first week being stunning. I couldn't believe how much interest there seemed to be. And I think you mentioned LA there. Our first game was in Tampa. So the Tampa Bay Buccaneers against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm getting my I'm getting my sports mixed up here. Tampa Bay against New England in the first game, and Tampa wasn't a sellout or anything like that, but the atmosphere was still good. But what I was going to say was LA played later against the Metro Stars, and we watched that with the team. Frank Stapleton was the coach of New England, the former Republic of Ireland, Arsenal, Manchester United striker. Frank and I got on really well, and we sat and watched the game with all the players. And, there were 70,000 people at the Rose Bowl, and nobody could figure that out because, really they didn't expect to get, I think they thought they'd be lucky if they got 25 or 30,000, but 70,000 people just walked up and watched this game. So the initial interest was huge because I think there was still a carryover effect from the World Cup in '94. People were starved of football. Remember, this was before the days when you could switch on a TV and watch the Premier League or Serie A or the Champions League easily. You could do it, but it took a huge amount of effort. So this was giving people their source of football. And I think in those early weeks, it really did hit home that, this could be something special.
And in the midst of your move over to the US to become press officer, back in Europe, the kind of change of franchise from the European Cup to the Champions League had started in 1992. So in 1995, ESPN get the rights to show that in the US. How does that work for you from a logistical standpoint? Are you having to travel to games, or are you watching the games commentating via a televised feed?
Well, initially, I had an involvement with ESPN International in those days, but not so much with the Champions League. My initial involvement was to cover the Brazilian League, the Dutch League, and a few other properties. And I was also involved in a project in New York with a company called CSI to make a South American highlights program that we sent around the world. So my Champions League involvement came later, and it's, got to the stage latterly in the 2000s where we had the rights in many territories around the world, not just the USA. But we would broadcast most of the games from the studio in Connecticut. For the later rounds, for the really big games, we'd be on site. And great memories of all the finals that I was lucky enough to do from site, particularly in the latter half of the first decade of the 2000s.
Yeah, I think one of those games I've heard you mention before was the 2005 final. And it probably won't be beaten. I guess for me, everyone knows about the Liverpool-Milan game. Is there any finals that stood out as being massively disappointing or just an event for a commentator?
I can't think of a Champions League final that I've done from site that really underwhelmed. I mean, I was the studio host actually at Old Trafford when Juventus and Milan played each other, and that was a disappointment. So I'd have to say that was. But 2005 Istanbul, 2006 Paris, when Barcelona came back to beat Arsenal, that was a super final. 2007 in Athens, I was there. Milan, Liverpool, that maybe didn't quite live up to finals of around that period. 2008 was terrific in Moscow. I think we were still broadcasting at about 1:30 in the morning when Manchester United finally overcame Chelsea. And then one of my favourites too was in Rome, 2009, Barcelona against Manchester United. And that was one, as a broadcaster, I was especially proud of because it was our last final with the whole rights package. We knew we were losing the rights. And I was determined that everything was going to be flawless, that we were going to go out on a high. And I think that one really had a lot of polish to it, the way it was broadcast, the way it was handled. So, as I say, proud of that one. And then in the years ahead, I got to broadcast a couple of other finals. And the one that obviously stays with me most was the old German final at Wembley that I broadcast for ESPN International. They had rights just for certain territories. And they said, since you're on site, I was living in London at the time, could you broadcast that one for us? So that was a real thrill to have two German teams for me in the final. But no, I've been quite lucky. I can't think of any duds, really, that I've broadcast in terms of Champions League finals.
I was going to say, as a commentator, if you get the option to sit through a Milan-Juventus 0-0 draw all the way to penalties and then get rewarded with the finals you just listed thereafter, you would take that more often than not.
Absolutely, yeah. And as a commentator, I mean, listen, we can't control what material we're given. We're at the mercy of the game in front of us. And that's why when people say, oh, that was a great commentary last night, I often say, well, the game was great, or maybe they're entitled to say it wasn't such a good commentary because the game was bad. We take the rough with the smooth.
Yeah. I'm quite interested in something you just said that I'd forgot to note. So you've done, with ESPN, you've done a CSI program, which was part of the South American leagues. So that would have been covering teams like Palmeiras, Boca, River Plate. See, at the time, was there any players that you became aware of before they made big European moves? I'm looking back at, I think Channel 5 used to do a lot of the Argentinian football years ago, and you had Javi Saviola at 15, Juan Riquelme coming through. Were there players that you knew of before, and were you ever contacted as a correspondent about players that were potentially going to move to Europe?
Yes, is the answer to that. And it actually was a terrific project to be part of, because I worked with a crew that consisted of a couple of South Americans who were steeped in football from that continent, a couple of very capable American producers, very small, tight-knit team. We would convene in New York on a Tuesday. I would jump on the train. I'd be sent this ream of fax paper, because, again, it was before internet. So I'd get about 60 pages of fax paper. And I had an antiquated fax machine at the time. It wasn't, I'll show you, it wasn't paper like this that I'm holding it up. Wasn't normally for paper. It was the sort of old-fashioned, lower quality paper that just was sort of one big thread, if you like. And I would get this sent to me overnight on a Monday. I would read every word. It was all in Spanish, which I could speak by this point. It was all with me on the train, 4 hours on the train, and I would just, make my little notes from it. But it had reports on, every game from South America played over the weekend. And then we'd go in and we'd edit it all. And then the next day, I'd put a voice on it. And it was an hour-long program. And I really wish that it had had a bigger penetration. It was put together as part of the package, funnily enough, for rights holders who had the Premier League. And this was like an extra offering that CSI was making, because CSI had rights to the Premier League around the world. So if you were in Africa, per se, you would get the Premier League and you would get this show as part of the package as well. But to answer your question, yes, you mentioned Riquelme. There's one who, we saw very early on. Hernan Crespo is another one who we saw, extremely early on, saw how good he was. People like Ariel Ortega, I can remember back then. People like I'm trying to think who else I would single out as being somebody who we saw. Matias Almeida, who went on to play in Serie A. Just all these players coming through at that particular time. And I'm just mentioning Argentinian players here. We had, for example, I remember getting calls from Scotland, Sebastian Rosenthal, who was a player who we covered a lot from Chile. He got injured, and that sort of held him back a bit. But I suddenly started getting a lot of calls from Scottish journalists about Sebastian Rosenthal. And it did make me, I'm not going to say an expert on South American football, but it's funny. I've kind of had spells in my life where, because of the project I've worked on, I've had particular knowledge about particular sectors of the world football scene at different times. So, in the mid-90s, to late 90s, it would have been South America, then Serie A, then La Liga. I was the commentator for La Liga for a number of years. And more recently, and during all that time, the Bundesliga, because of my German language fluency. So I've always really enjoyed that aspect of having that little bit of extra knowledge, hopefully, that you can put to good use just through watching something closely. And in my case, I was lucky just because those were the projects I was working on.
Yeah, you mentioned there Sebastian Rosenthal signing for Rangers. So in 2009, Setanta, who had previously tried to, I guess, promote Scottish football the best way they could, had suffered financial difficulty and were releasing the rights as of 2009-10 onwards. How did that come about for ESPN to take over the rights, and how much time did you get to set up the project to take over?
That was a whirlwind summer, the summer of 2009. I was actually on holiday back in Aberdeenshire with my wife, Beth, and all this was happening while we were on holiday. Now, what had happened was, as you said, Setanta had hit the financial rocks, and they were not to be part of the scene anymore with regard to the Premier League in England and the top flight coverage in Scotland. So ESPN moved in to essentially take over all the rights that had been previously owned by Setanta. They had about 60 days to put it all together. And what they tried to do was use their existing resources as far as possible to do that. Now, simultaneously, I had been thinking that it would be nice to one day return to the UK market in some capacity, just because I think I felt I had some unfinished business. I'd left at 24. I'd spent 5 years, 5 busy, productive years at the BBC. But I think part of me felt, you know what, I'm a much better commentator, I think, now than I was when I left. I'd like to be able to show that to people back home. Because you have to remember, in 2009, most people in the UK wouldn't have had an earthly who I was. You know, I was working in a different market. If you'd been traveling, maybe you would have heard my work. Most people wouldn't have known. So ESPN came to me and said, you know, we've been thinking, we've lost the Champions League rights, as I knew. Would you be interested in being part of our setup in the UK, you know, at least on a temporary basis while we get this started? So they needed a commentator, obviously, for Scottish football. And that was where we started with it. They said, you know, we'd love it if you would do the Scottish games. Now, the problem was I still had commitments here in the USA, still under contract. So for that year, we agreed that I would fly to Scotland when there was a game to cover, because they only had 30 games altogether. It wasn't a game every single week. And then fly back and do my other work here in the USA, which amounted to presenting the daily program that I presented called Press Pass, commentating on Spanish football from time to time, just little bits and pieces here and there. So we did that for that one season. And I went back determined, I must say, to have a fresh sound and perspective. And I did a series of interviews with newspaper guys before that 2009-2010 season. And I made a point of saying that. And I got the feeling a few of them were a bit skeptical because they didn't all know me. And, you know, they probably, some of them maybe thought, here's a guy from America. What does he think he's walking into Scottish football? But of course, I'm a Scot, you know, and I've always, you know, had Scottish football in me. But I did want to come in and be positive. I wanted to come in with a positive attitude, a fresh sound, a fresh approach, and not sort of drag the thing down, but talk it all up. And so that was the initial idea I had in 2009.
Yes, since you had left Scotland, I think the SPL had been structured. Rangers had done 9 in a row. Celtic had made a UEFA Cup final. Rangers had done the same. Did you notice a drop-off in, I don't want to say quality, but potential talent from the league you had left? Because I think in 1991, Rangers were buying a lot of English Premier League players due to the European ban. And were there any players that you, I guess, wish you'd been there for commentating? If I think of, I always think, I'm a Rangers fan myself, but I always think fondly of the Dundee side that the Caballero brothers built, or Benetti brothers, sorry, and then Laudrup, Larsson, Frank Sosay at Hibs. Was there any players you wish you had been there for?
Well, it's funny you bring up that era of Laudrup, Larsson, and you mentioned Sosay too, and that Dundee team. Canija, of course, played for them, Nemsadze. With regard to that era, I actually did commentate on Scottish football, but nobody in Scotland will have heard it because ESPN for a spell had international rights to Scottish football. So between, I'm going to say around 2000 and 2004, in addition to my Spanish coverage, I was doing Scottish football for ESPN around the world. So people in Australia would hear it, New Zealand, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, Latin America, but not in Scotland. So I did have the benefit of having commentated on that era. And you're talking from a Rangers point of view, you're talking about Jörg Alberts, you're talking about the De Boer brothers when they were there, Michael Moles, so obviously a high echelon player. I did notice that when I came back in 2009, and the thing is, I'd always been watching Scottish football, so it wasn't as though, suddenly I'm switching on to something I hadn't seen before. Yeah. But I was well aware that the quality of play was down a bit. It wasn't what it was even 4 or 5 years prior to that. But at the same time, I'm a big believer in what I call our football. And by that, I mean, as a Scottish football. It's our football. It doesn't actually matter if the standard is here or somewhere in between. It's our football. And Scottish people will always gravitate to it. You know, if the quality dipped all the way down to here tomorrow, but Scottish football were still to be played, people would still go to the games. You know, so that made me quite confident going into it, that I understood enough about the Scottish mentality and about Scottish football, this our football concept that I wanted to stress. That made me confident that things would be fine.
You seem like someone, Derek, who quite likes to get in on something at the ground level as such, because if I look at the press office for the build-up to the USA 94, MLS starting when you were a commentator, things like the South American package for ESPN, and then ESPN UK taking over the SPL. Was that the motivation for staying as a permanent member in 2010?
Yeah, I think what had happened was 2009, we had this arrangement whereby I would go back and forth and travel all the time. We realized by about Christmas that it wasn't sustainable, that something had to give. And, you know, either we had to say, right, I, you know, choose the USA, or I choose coming back permanently. And I think I was so invested in what the crew was doing by this point. And remember, I was also broadcasting Serie A and Bundesliga and other properties for ESPN UK, and I you know, worked very effectively with all those people. Great memories of the teammates I had at ESPN UK back then. It just felt to me as though, and you said it, this is a new project. We need to see this through. You know, I would have been gutted if I had just had 1 year at that and then, you know, left it and watched other people doing it. I think there is something in what you say. I think my life has been full of giving my all to something at the very start of a project, trying to get that project established, trying to make it really good and polished and high quality. And then at a certain point, saying, okay, I've done what I set out to do here. Let's move on and try something else. And I think this was probably a good example of that. I certainly knew in the summer of 2010 that I was not ready to say goodbye to Scotland, that my love affair with Scottish football had been rekindled after many years away. And I knew I wasn't going to be there forever. I knew that. But I wanted to enjoy this for a time more. And a lot of that, again, down to just, you know, being back in Scotland, telling the stories that you tell on a week-to-week basis, being at the different grounds, talking to the different people there, and also my colleagues at ESPN UK, because it was a small crew, a Scottish-based crew that produced and directed the games, and they're all still my friends to this day.
Yeah, and I guess on that, you talked about visiting grounds. So the Scottish League, pending a current restructure, it can get a bit monotonous, I think, for some fans, because you see teams and grounds 4, 5, 6 times a season, depending on if you get drawn in cup games. Was what happened in 2012 with Rangers maybe part of the reason that you decided to continue on? I'm just thinking, as Rangers dropping into the third division and the lure of ESPN and then BT Sport getting games as Rangers came through the divisions, whereby you would visit grounds that you maybe normally wouldn't have got the chance to?
Well, it's funny. I didn't think of it in those terms at the time. I think at the time everybody was a bit concerned about the TV contract and what might happen. And I'll be honest, I was very concerned about what was going to happen with ESPN UK, because that channel was in a little bit of doubt. We were hearing things from headquarters about possibly wrapping up, and they did wrap up in 2013. But the Rangers story obviously had its own intrigue. And as I say, it didn't hit me straight away, but it was when it was put to me that, okay, we're now going to be covering Rangers games in the lowest tier of Scottish football. And that's going to mean setting up equipment at grounds that most people have never seen on TV before. That's when it began to kind of sort of enter my head. I thought, okay, this actually could be really intriguing as a broadcaster. So I don't mean disrespect to Rangers when I say this, but the excitement for me was not so much that it was Rangers, but as the commentator, the chance to go and broadcast to all these grounds that no commentator really ever had the opportunity to broadcast from before. And I would wager no commentator will really get the chance to do so again. So I kind of feel I was in a bit of a privileged position that I was able to go to Berwick and tell the Berwick story. I was able to go to Stenhousemuir and tell the Stenhousemuir story in a way that you simply don't or can't on a week-to-week basis as a commentator or a broadcaster. And I sort of liken that time to the magic of the FA Cup in England. Now, I know the FA Cup has, hit the rocks a little bit in recent years, but I've always been a bit jealous of English football. My colleagues in England get to talk warmly about all the great stories, of teams down the divisions. We don't really have those same stories in Scotland to the same extent. We don't have this, Berwick Rangers beat Rangers in 1967. That's the upset that most people dwell on. But we don't sort of have this well of feel-good stories from down the divisions, from teams down the divisions. So, to rock up at Glebe Park in Brechin with its famous hedge, at Station Park in Forfar where I could have a bridie in my hand before the game and talk about it on the air. These, for me, were the stories of Scottish football that made and make Scottish football come to life. And it was a real privilege to be able to do that tour, if you like, of lower division Scottish football grounds.
And I think as a fan of Rangers myself, it was a kind of there was a niceness to it when you were visiting these grounds and seeing these teams you'd never played before, because you could have just been in the top league playing Ross County, Hamilton 3-4 times a season, but it was nice to see grounds that otherwise I would never have had an excuse to visit. As we talked about, ESPN and then BT Sports switched over in 2013. Champions League football is going to return to BT Sport, which you're now a part of. How did that feel 4 seasons down the line since you'd last covered with ESPN? And what was the landscape now like with access to all the games? Because obviously BT Sport has taken the Champions League to a whole new level within the UK with their goals coverage and commentators at every game. What was that like and how was it sold to you? Did you know what type of games you were going to be covering, whether it be with your language skills you were going to be covering European games, or was it going to be Celtic or Rangers in Europe?
Well, you have to remember, first of all, that the Champions League dimension didn't crop up immediately with BT Sport. That only came after the channel was up and running. So what happened was ESPN UK, as I said in one of the previous answers, ESPN UK packed up and BT Sport kind of almost did what ESPN UK had done in 2009. They came onto the scene and took over some of the rights. In fact, it seemed to be about 90% of the rights that ESPN UK had. Now, a lot of people assume in broadcasting that these things just happen as a matter of course, and they'll just take the same presenter and the same commentator. Ain't necessarily so. And I genuinely didn't know if I was going to be invited to join the BT Sports crew until, I'm going to say about April of that year, April of 2013. And it had been rumoured, there were a couple of newspaper articles about it saying I was already signed up, which I wasn't. I hadn't even had a conversation with them at that point. But they did say, no, we very much would like to have you come in. But, there were still negotiations to be had. And what ended up happening was the production team that I spoke warmly about earlier from the ESPN UK days, Grant Phillips, the director, Martin Keegan, the producer, and many of the others, they actually followed on to BT Sport. Different production company, but many of the same people. Some new people too. But, Dal Curry, who's a very good friend of mine, he had been the reporter on Scottish football, occasional presenter of it in the ESPN UK days. He was to be the main presenter for BT Sport. I was to be the commentator. Gary McAllister was to be my co-commentator, which I was very excited about. And we went in and we all kind of agreed, we all had the same mantra going in, that we were all Scots. We all loved our football, to come back to that expression again, and we wanted to be very positive about it. We wanted to sell this in a way that will make Scots proud. And I think, in saying that, there was an implication that in the past, maybe the default position had been to not accentuate the positive, to kind of, maybe sort of, drag things down a little bit from time to time. I'll say that there's part of the Scottish nature that can do that. But we thought we want to be positive about it because, if you're going to pay for a subscription channel, the chances are you are enthusiastic about Scottish football. So let's be enthusiastic about it. So to the second part of the question about the Champions League, that came later. And obviously I was very excited because I felt the Champions League was in my DNA. It wasn't, emphasized to me at that point exactly what games I'd be doing. As it turned out, and I knew this, it would be, if there was Scottish representation, I would do the Scottish teams, occasionally English teams, German teams very likely, and that is certainly what came to pass. But of course, I was at the mercy of whether or not we had a Scottish team in the Champions League, and some years yes, some years no. Otherwise, it would be a Scottish team in the Europa League. So, just to be back covering those competitions was certainly a great thrill.
Yeah, it is interesting you say that. Like, I'm very aware of you for a variety of different things, but it does depend on the Champions League game you watch. It does depend on the TV network you watch your league on. But I think probably the biggest game that stood out for me that I knew you commentated on was the Monaco run through Kylian Mbappe when they beat Dortmund 3-2. That's a game that I categorically remember you commentating on. Did you feel sometimes that, I've noticed that you will do a lot of German games to the Champions League, but often if they then face an English side, it's substituted out for whoever the prime English commentator is for that team. Is that something that was known, or is that something that's actually a hindrance when you're covering the games? Because Bayern Munich are playing Chelsea and you know so much about Bayern Munich, but there is an English network, so they take the English commentator?
Well, I think, the honest answer is every commentator wants to broadcast the game that they think they are, closest to in terms of a relationship. And, obviously, I'll give you an example. Celtic played Manchester City in the Champions League, and I was hopeful that I might get that game at Celtic Park as the Scottish voice, but I didn't get that game. And I was put on an Arsenal-Basel game that night instead. Great game to do, but I really wanted to do Celtic against Manchester City, and I felt that as the Scottish commentator, the home game for the Scottish team, I had a case. But listen, I can't do anything about that. It's not my decision. It's the manager who picks the team, and the manager that night decided that their lead commentator, Darren Fletcher, should get that game. So listen, I never have any complaints about it, but obviously I can want to do certain games, just as every commentator, wants to do certain games. And yeah, you'll watch a game. If I watch a German team playing against an English team, I will know that there are things I would be able to say about that German team that a commentator who doesn't cover Bundesliga football simply wouldn't have in his repertoire. At the same time, that commentator probably has a lot more to say about the English team than I might, because I'm not covering English football week in, week out. So it's, you win some, you lose some. But yeah, I think it's normal to be disappointed when you don't get an assignment that you really in your heart feel that you have a strong case to get.
Yeah, and so in that time, you've seen Rangers come through the divisions and Rangers get back to the SPL. You leave a year later. This is not me implying anyway that Rangers dropping, Rangers coming back up was a change to it, but was there maybe an element within the Scottish football that you kind of felt like you'd done the Rangers Celtic top six race before, and that you were at the end of that project, you delivered what you wanted to, the SPL was back where it kind of left, and you wanted to try something new?
I think there was an element of that. I don't know so much about Rangers being in the top flight, being the decisive factor, but I think it was more a case of, I arrived back on the scene in 2009. It had been 8 years. I had, done these different things, including the games down the divisions. Celtic at that stage were very dominant in terms of winning most things. I think for me, it was more just, I felt I had done everything that I had tried to prove at the outset, hopefully. I thought, okay, I've done 8 years. Hopefully people now who didn't know my work know my work. Maybe some will like it, maybe some won't. That's the nature of the commentary business. But at least I've been able to put my stamp on it for a period. And I always knew that I wanted to come back to the USA. So a big part of it wasn't so much about leaving Scotland or the UK. It was about coming back here, because I was also conscious of the fact that, I've worked in this TV market for a long time, covering most of the major tournaments for a long time ESPN predominantly. Fox were about to get the rights to the World Cup in 2018 over here. And I just felt that at a certain point, I needed to come back here just to be in position for the next phase of my career, whatever that was to be. And I didn't really know at the time. But it probably, again, comes down to new projects, new things. I should also say that around 2015, I began working in Germany for the Bundesliga as a commentator on their world feed. And that meant going to Germany a lot. Through conversations with my colleagues in Germany, it became clear that even if I moved back to the USA, they would still have an interest in having me come to Germany occasionally and keeping that relationship going. And that really appealed to me. Now, a few people said to me, oh, why don't you try doing the same kind of thing with Scottish football? I felt that would have been wrong on a number of grounds. One, because with the Bundesliga, I'm one of many, so I'm part of a team of people who are sort of interchangeable. With Scottish football, I broadcast every Scottish football match that BT Sport covered, that ESPN UK covered, going all the way back to the start of that period. So we're talking, hundreds of Scottish football matches. I didn't feel it would ever be right to pick and choose my games, to say, you know what, maybe I could stay on and maybe I'll come back for this big final and this big game and I could do that. I did not want to be that guy. And I thought that, when I leave, because this has been such a huge chunk of my life, 8 years putting my heart and soul into this, when I leave, I want to say, that's it, no regrets. I did it again, pass the torch to somebody else. And so that was kind of uppermost in my mind in terms of making that decision. And as I say, when I left, I didn't really have any, definitive prospects back here other than the Bundesliga and a couple of other small things. I was really starting again. But again, it was from a position of having contacts over here, knowing what was ahead, knowing who I should speak to, and hopefully my work doing a bit of the talking.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head as a Scottish football fan. If you weren't, I think there is a feeling if you aren't going to be in it 100% there to motivate just Scottish football, it does need to be passed over to someone else. And I think a lot of people are very respectful for the way that BT have handled it. I know Chris Sutton is a very controversial figure on Twitter, but the one thing Chris Sutton is unapologetically for is the promotion of Scottish football. And the same way Ali McCoy, Kevin Thompson, Darryl Curry, and all the BT Sport members are tremendous at continuing on the job that you started. But I've mentioned a few of your co-commentators there, and I want to go on to something that we've mentioned, the younger generation. So one of your other co-commentators is Lee Dixon.
Yep.
On FIFA 2000 and FIFA 2019. Ironically, you're one of the commentators that's probably been heard around the world by millions every day just now for football games that aren't happening live. How does the FIFA thing come about?
Well, that comes about totally by chance, really. I was back here in the USA, so we're talking now November 2017. I've been back a couple of months, and I got an email, a bit of a mysterious email from somebody with strong connections to, as it was put to me, a video game company. And was I interested in having a chat about possible involvement? So it kind of started there, all very mysterious. And eventually it emerged that it was the big one. It was EA Sports FIFA. And they were interested in having a conversation with me about being a commentator on the game because there was the prospect of getting the Champions League rights for FIFA. And this is a real lesson for every broadcaster. Always be aware that there's somebody listening somewhere. And it went all the way back to my days covering the Champions League for ESPN. That the lead producer had been an avid viewer and listener of those games that I broadcast. You've got to remember that EA Sports are based in Vancouver, in Canada, for FIFA. And so they used to watch our coverage every week. And I didn't know it at the time, but he had always said to himself, if ever I get the chance, if ever we have the Champions League, there's somebody I want to talk to about that. So that's how it all started. And the funny thing was, it was all very cloak and dagger because I couldn't say anything about it to anybody for about 6 months until it was formally consummated, if you like, until it was properly revealed. And FIFA 19 was my first year in the game. Lee Dixon, who I actually worked with from time to time on NBC covering the Premier League, and actually used to live just down the road from me in London when I was living in London. Lee was to be my co-commentator on that.
How is the process from recording the game commentary for that? I've listened to a podcast, if anyone wants to listen to it, it's called 30 by 30, and it's the introduction of the Madden game, and it covers John Madden doing a lot of the commentary lines. How much input do you and Lee have on those? Are you recording them together? And how many hours a day and over which period are you populating that data?
In terms of how we do it and how we come up with phrases for it, that is all our own organic work. So think of it this way. There's a scenario given to us, maybe a free kick just outside the box, and it just goes narrowly wide. Say that as you would say it in commentary. So it's my job to come up with 10 different ways of saying that. Now, when you get to the 9th or 10th different option, there's only so many ways you can say something. So that's the challenge. It's a creative challenge. It's a vocal challenge. So you spoke about volume. It tends to be more than 20 days a year, not consecutively, but we're talking full days with some breaks in between. And we have to pace ourselves because you can't go all out at a very high volume for half an hour and not expect there to be vocal repercussions, so to speak. So we do it on that basis. We're not always together. Oftentimes we're doing it separately, and I'll do my bit and Lee will hear it and then he'll do his bit. And for me, a lot of the job is names. So name after name after name after name, sometimes for hours, just names. And of course you have basic inflections. If I were to do your name, Walker. If I were to do a slightly, higher one, Walker, and then Walker, and then all the way to the very nth degree of it, So it's, and just imagine that, multiplied by several thousand names, So we're trying to be as comprehensive as we can with all the names. So introductions, names, it's great fun. I mean, anybody from the crew will tell you when I walk in there every day, I have a smile on my face, and it's a labor of love.
It's just really interesting to hear that that's definitely changed since Madden in the early 90s, whereby a lot of the podcast is deleted scenes and recordings of audio where John Madden's asking which person wrote the line because they obviously don't know anything about football.
Well, all I can say is I put my own slant on it and my own word, and I love that, actually. I find it's great to be able to it makes you think about the art of commentary even more when you think about different ways to say things and challenging yourself to do that. And ultimately, I don't decide what goes in the game and what doesn't. That's for the production crew to make a determination on. But no, it's a lot of fun, and honestly, it's a real honor to be in the game because there are so many great commentators out there. They could have asked any one of them, and the fact that they asked me, as I say, I'm very grateful, and I love every day that I go into the studio to help make it.
One of the little niche points of doing the FIFA commentary is the mode called FIFA Ultimate Team, whereby you'll sometimes get historical players from the 60s, 70s, 80s in your team. That kind of leads me on to a question that you'll now have commentated on games with George Best, Pelé. Who would be the one player that if you were to go back to an era and call a game that they were involved in, who would that player be? For
me, and this is just for me, it would be Johan Cruyff. And that is a function of the fact that I was born in 1967. My early interest in football arrived in the early 1970s, just as Cruyff was the star. I mean, he was the player everybody wanted to be. Now, you could make a case for Best as well. I was more a Cruyff guy. And it may have been just a sort of a fascination with the Netherlands, with their strip at the time, with Ajax, who were revolutionary, and he was the symbol of that team. I just used to think that he was a magician, that what he did, nobody else could do. And so when I was out kicking the ball in the street in Aberdeen in 1973, 74, the player I was imagining I was at that time was Cruyff. And that's not to say he was the best ever. I think he'll go down as one of the best ever. If you were a little bit older than me, you might say Pelé. I saw a little bit of him at the end of his career, not enough for him to sort of be the guy in my mind who I think of as my footballing hero on a worldwide basis. Best was always a bit controversial too. Cruyff was in a different way, but I kind of admired his manner, his deep thinking way, and always seemed to have a view that was very much his when it came to football. Even after he stopped playing. So for me, yeah, that would be Cruyff.
And you've said there the reason for that was the 1974 World Cup. In your career, you've covered loads of major tournaments. Has there been anything that's thrown you a little bit? I'm thinking to the World Cup in Russia being the introduction of VAR. Do you get made aware of those rule changes and how they're going to work for commentary? And how does that get approached by the organisers?
Funnily enough, I didn't find VAR to be all that complicated. And again, that may have come down to the fact that I'd had the advantage of working in the Bundesliga with VAR already in place. And the Bundesliga was way ahead of just about every other league in terms of, first of all, having the pilot program with VAR and then having it as part of the league. I noticed that my colleagues from the UK were more confused by it and seemed to have more trouble with it. I didn't really think it was that controversial or complicated. And I thought it was an enhancement. And I still, in my core, believe that. I believe that we are better off with it. Now, there are different ways to use it. And I think there have been more problems in England than in virtually every other country. I think they made a number of bad decisions with regard to its implementation. But the other part of your question, there are always briefings before tournaments so that media are made aware of what the thinking is. Now, sometimes what you actually see can seem to contradict what you were told in a briefing beforehand. But I actually thought 2018, for the most part, it was pretty smooth. There wasn't an awful lot of controversy, and that it was implemented the right way.
Has there been any introduction of new rules at World Cups or new seasons that you think have been? I'm thinking to the handball rule specifically just now.
Well, I think at the Women's World Cup last year, and I was in France for that, for Fox, women's football, as you know, is obviously a very big deal here in the USA, and not for nothing are the USA world champions. But we saw, I think, at the Women's World Cup last year, how dangerous it can be to make significant law changes and have VAR at the same time with referees who are not really accustomed to VAR. And that was the case for most of the referees in the Women's World Cup. And of course, the law change that came in that was especially controversial had to do with goalkeepers trying to save penalties. Yep. And of course, Scotland paid the full price for that, thinking back to the game against Argentina, much talked about. And so that's one that I think in retrospect, they got wrong. They were a bit too hasty in saying, yeah, we're going to have VAR and we're going to punish goalkeepers in this, very draconian manner. And probably they didn't anticipate what the end product of those decisions would actually be.
Yeah, and there was a massive misinterpretation of those rules, I believe, during that. So for those who don't know, Scotland were 3-2 up against Argentina. Argentina were given a late penalty and Alexander saved the penalty, leaving a line, but it was only VAR that called that, and it was apparently not meant to be used for the keeper. That was meant to be the linesman's job, and VAR was only meant to be used for encroachment on rebounds. So you talked about covering the World Cup in France. I think the World Cup in 2019 in France was probably the biggest set of eyes on any women's tournament there had been. I think personally back in the UK was the same because Scotland and England were meeting in the first game, Scotland's first World Cup in 21 years. They'd been at the Euros in 2017. And I've seen that the USA final figures were viewed more, the Women's World Cup, obviously the USA were in it, by about 5-6 million more than the men's. What is the feeling about the women's game in the US? I know there's a massive upheaval just now between the women's game and what the payments should have been for that.
Well, it's complicated, and I think it's going to go on for quite some time. What you would have to say is that women's football, in particular the US women's national team, has a particular place in the narrative of football in this country in a way it probably doesn't in any other country, maybe with the exception of the Scandinavian countries, where there's always been a healthy respect for the women's game. The fact of the matter is that the US women's national team has been a very big moneymaker for US soccer, going back over a number of years. And they're not just great football players, they are also role models. They are role models for an entire generation of girls in this country, of women. And you have to remember, in this country too, this thing called Title IX that came in many years ago gives women athletes advantages that they wouldn't have otherwise. So it's a very positive way of approaching it. And the rest of the world is still sort of catching up. I think it's the one area where the US is certainly well ahead is with regard to helping women's sports. Now, I think when it comes to the club game in this country, the scene there is a bit more muddled. We've had different leagues come in, then they've gone out of business, and it comes back in a different form, and so on it goes. Attendances for those games, not as healthy. So the one thing that people coalesce around is the women's national team. And they did show in France, once again, that they are the best.
Yeah, and it was point you said that about the Scandinavian, because Scotland obviously have Fiona Brown out there playing for Rosengard, and we've got Lana Cleland out in Florence playing for Fiorentina, Rachel Corsie at Utah Royals. So there are players all around, and every one of them has reported back to me is that there's a higher understanding of professionalism. Back in Scotland, Rangers and Celtic moving to professional level, Hearts semi-pro, Glasgow City following suit as well. So the game is rising through the whole world, but I think the mainstay has been that the USA are the biggest and best at that and are the champion for women's football. I just want to talk about major international tournaments in general. So whether male or female, what is the best tournament you think you've covered or been part of, and what was the best game or player?
Ooh, I have to think about the second part for a second. So I'll dive into the first part. I think the best tournament I have covered would be Euro 2008. I think that tournament really set very high standards for the quality of matches. I can think of so many just outstanding games in that tournament. And I often wonder if in the UK people don't pay as much attention to it because there were no British representatives in that Euro. But I just think from start to finish, it was absolutely captivating. And the team that gave me most joy as a commentator were Turkey, who were the surprise package of that European Championship, making it all the way to the semi-finals. And it was one Turkish miracle after another. They seemed to manage to come back from the dead just about every time. So I'd have to say Euro 2008. I would say Russia 2018 is not far behind. It's probably the best World Cup I've covered in terms of the quality of play, in terms of how compelling the games were. Best player I have covered in a World Cup. Again, I'm still thinking about that. I'm still just trying to make sure I haven't forgotten one player or another. I'm going to give that one to Ronaldo, the Brazilian Ronaldo, because I think that he is underrated. I think that amid all the talk nowadays about the other Ronaldo, and don't get me wrong, he's brilliant, we've forgotten how inspirational and influential Brazil's Ronaldo was for the Seleção. And, people talk about his physique and all the rest of it, and look at him now. He was one magnificent footballer. And without him, Brazil would not have won the World Cup in 2002. So I'm going to say Ronaldo. I should say Maradona, but I didn't commentate. Well, I guess I did commentate on Maradona. I did commentate on Maradona in that game in 1990. But I didn't commentate on him in 94 because I was working as the press officer for the World Cup. So Ronaldo is my answer.
Yeah, and I'd be inclined to agree. I've spent the last umpteen weeks watching all the Amazon have every World Cup from 90 onwards, and 98 and 2002 is just phenomenal. Even latterly in 2006 World Cup as well, when he broke the record that was then broken by Closer. Derek, I cannot let you leave without talking about the Bundesliga. So as we stand just now, if you take out the Belarusian league just now, we're potentially looking at the Bundesliga being the first league back, and the possibility of you for the UK and the US kind of becoming the voice of football as it stands. If German football is first back, everyone knows you've spoken about language and studying German and politics. Where did the love of German football come from, and do you have a German team?
The love of German football really went hand in hand with my love of German language and culture. So it started with the 1974 World Cup, and that opened my eyes to German geography, to all these German cities. Obviously, it was West Germany back then, and they played East Germany in that World Cup, and that made me very curious. I studied German at school. It was my best subject, my favorite subject. I had a flair for it. And obviously, I was very interested in football. And I worked out that from Aberdeen, there was a radio signal that came right across the North Sea from the main radio station in Hamburg, NDR. And through that, I could listen to German radio when I wanted to. And that meant I could listen to the Bundesliga. So I used to, from a very young age in the early 1980s, early teenage years, I used to enhance my German by listening to the Bundesliga Konferenzschaltung, as it was known, the conference broadcast, where they would switch from one ground to another, and it was all very dramatic and passionate. And, you know, I improved my vocabulary no end just by listening to this Konferenzschaltung every week. And so that's really where it started. And then I went to Germany. I worked for a spell, or helped out in a small comprehensive school right on the border of the two Germanys in West Germany. But when I say on the border, just yards from the East German border, with the guards looking right in at us. And that's when I started going to games in Germany. So this would be the mid-1980s when I was there studying. And I used to go a lot to the home games of a team called Hessen Kassel, who were then in the second division and pushing very strongly for promotion to the top flight. They never quite made it. But the other team I had an affinity with, and they were very good at the time, they had some of the best players in Germany, Cologne, as you would translate it into English. I always prefer to say Köln, because just as we say Napoli for the team from Naples and Sevilla for the team from Seville, I think we should say Köln, which is the name of the team in Germany. But it's the carnival city. It's got its own atmosphere. It's probably the city I know best in Germany. Spent more time there than anywhere else. A lot of friends in Köln. And their motto is Spürbar anders. For goodness sake, they've got a goat as the club mascot. So Spürbar anders basically means feel the difference. And you can feel the difference with Köln. So that's the team that I sort of have in my heart as the German team that I like. I have fondness for a few other small clubs, such as Babelsberg, just on the edge of Berlin, who I try and go and see from time to time. But Köln, amongst the teams that most people would know, would be the one that I like above all others.
Yeah, and whilst we're on topic of Germany, so I seen Bayern Munich put a release about the 50-1 rule. So this has been a kind of controversial rule a wee bit in Germany with other teams. So can you just explain to people who maybe don't know the 50-1 rule and how that works for shareholders and how ownerships of the clubs come about?
Well, in simple terms, German clubs are members clubs, so that, you know, like you, John, or I can buy shares in a club, can be members of a club and have full voting rights, and your next door neighbour can also have full voting rights. And the idea is that it's a sort of a community thing. Yep. And so 50+1 means that it puts a limit on the number of shares that can go outside the 50+1. So the idea is that you don't have, you know, consortiums from, you know, wealthy companies from other countries who come in and basically buy up a club, as we see now in England. That is very much against the German model. So people will say, well, hang on, aren't there exceptions to that? There are a few exceptions to that. Bayer Leverkusen, for one, are an exception to that, and that is historical, because Bayer Leverkusen are the footballing arm, if you like, that was set up by the Bayer Chemical Company as a social club, if you like, a sporting social club for the families of the Bayer Chemical Company. So because of this historical connection, they're allowed to continue in that fashion. Same with Wolfsburg and Volkswagen, and the role that they played with regard to Volkswagen when they came into being. Volkswagen, the people's car, if you like. And again, there was a sort of an element of social responsibility around the whole concept. But by and large, the feeling in Germany is that, you know, we don't want to go down the road of English clubs and clubs in other countries where, you know, a rich person in another country just wants to come in and buy up the club. So 50+1 is meant to guard against that. Bayern, for example, this weekend, and you made reference to them, have said that they think that it should be up to clubs to come up with their own rationale for this. And they say that for their part, they only allow 30% of the shares to go outside that system, so to speak. So it's much discussed and always a bit controversial.
And Leipzig, I believe, so this is only if you want to take your club publicly limited, is that correct? Because I believe Leipzig are doing it in I guess it's clever, but their main shares and members are actually employees of Red Bull. And I think that's where this discussions came from.
Yeah, it has. And it's one of the reasons why RB Leipzig are not loved by fans of most other German clubs. You could go into other reasons too. I mean, they essentially bought the rights of a struggling fifth-tier club called Makranstedt. It's interesting, in Germany, you can't just call a club any name. They have to fall within certain parameters of agreement. So there's an official list of prefixes you can give to football clubs. Now, one of them is Rasenballsport, basically means lawn bowls sports, if you like. But you can use that prefix RB, Rasenballsport. So somebody very clever in the marketing department realized they could name themselves Rasenballsport Leipzig, which would be shortened to RB or RB Leipzig. And lo and behold, you can probably con just about every fan and every journalist around the world that it's actually called Red Bull. But strictly speaking, it's not. That is not the name of the football club at all. But it's amazing how many people think it is.
And on that subject, over the years, so I'm talking maybe the last 25, 30 years, what would have been your favourite year covering German football? So for me, the standouts were Jupp Heynckes when he won the treble before being replaced by Pep. And there's actually a year that always stands out for me, and it's because it culminated in Michael Ballack missing the 2002 World Cup final. Was actually Bayer Leverkusen's season in 2002 was pretty dramatic as well. What one was your favourite to cover or even just be a part of as a fan?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Leverkusen because that would be one of my favourite seasons. And Leverkusen's so unlucky. When you think back to, how unlucky they were that year. And I listened to that on the radio in my back garden, just a few yards away from where I'm talking to you from now, on German radio, my old shortwave radio. And it was really sad for Bayer Leverkusen. Again, they're a club not loved by most German fans, but that really should have been their year. I think of the back-to-back years when Dortmund won the title under Klopp. I think that was very much a changing of the guard period, and really very magnetic from the point of view of the wider projection of German football. I go back to some of the seasons when Werder Bremen were the best team in the country under Otto Rehhagel when I was much younger. And, I think you could make a strong case for them as well. It varies, different years, different games within those years. I think last season was up there amongst the very best as they went right down to the wire, the big two, and Bayern were just a little bit too good. And I think this season was shaping up to be one of the best as well. I've always felt Bayern are still the best team, and if it were to finish, probably will be champions. But you never know what's around the corner.
Yeah, so hopefully German football will be back and we'll get to hear your voice on BT Sport more often than not. You're now working as freelance, but one of the more interesting roles I've seen pop up on your Twitter in the last few weeks was you've just become an ambassador. We mentioned it before. Berwick Rangers. So what will that entail and how did that come about?
It came about totally by chance, John. On Twitter, I obviously I've not been doing very much recently in comparison with my normal workload. So I still feel an affinity with some of the teams down the divisions in Scottish football, as we discussed earlier. And I just put a tweet out there saying, if there's a club, a lower tier club that maybe is putting together a video or something historical, something of a public service nature, and you might want my voice on it, if that would be of interest, just let me know. Well, I was contacted by a few different clubs, and Berwick came in with several requests, a lot of different things that they wanted to have voice. And I said, I'm only too happy to do that. And obviously I have fond memories of covering a couple of those Berwick Rangers against Rangers games during the time when Rangers were down the divisions. And so, did all these things for them. And then full credit to their marketing team and Nathan Thompson there. They came back and said, you know what, we've just been thinking about it. Would you be interested in being a club ambassador? And I thought about it and came to the conclusion that this would actually be a really fun thing to be part of, because, first of all, Berwick Rangers are unique. I mean, a team technically in England, playing in Scotland, now in the Lowland League, but really trying to get back up. And they've got a new board there doing a lot of very exciting things. So that appealed to me. One of my best friends here in the town where I live in Massachusetts is originally from Eyemouth, just up the road from Berwick, and is a lifelong Berwick Rangers fan. So he's been updating me for a long time about what's been happening at the club. So that seemed like a fit as well. And also just, we said earlier, they are responsible for, as a Rangers fan, the biggest upset in the history of the Scottish Cup. So I just thought on all levels, there's a chance to do something good for a team that is in need at the moment, and I would love to see Berwick Rangers come back into the divisions. And if I could play a very small part in making that come about, and goodness knows what that would be from afar at the moment. But, if I can spread the word a little bit about Berwick Rangers, then that's a project that excites me.
Yeah, it just struck my interest. I was just curious. Derek, thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I look forward to hearing your voice on BT Sport more than I've been hearing on the FIFA 2020 game just now. Thank you again.
Well, I hope you're not too sick of hearing me on FIFA 20. I'm sure there are some people who are, given the extent to which that game has been played. But John, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.